A yellow sheet like this. If you didn't get a handout, why don't you get one in the back? And I'd invite you to take just a couple minutes to look it over, read through it. Give me a few seconds to look over the yellow handout to move into the lecture tonight. And throughout this series, I've been interested in contemporary questions. I'm not interested in these theologians as a sort of historical people or in becoming aware of some esoteric field, but I'm always interested in how theology can help us deal with our life, real-life situations. And tonight we have a perfect example of that because we're talking about how to improve our personal relationships. I mean, it's sort of hard to be unconcerned about that problem. We are all in relationships and we have to try to improve them, and most of us feel that there's ways in which we are not doing as well as we might. So that's the whole burden of this thing, is to look at that question, to examine it, and not in a vacuum or just by ourselves, but in conversation with a particular great thinker, in this case Martin Buber, the great religious thinker, Jewish thinker of the 20th century. Now, to sort of work our way into the problem, before I get on with this, I'm going to stop sooner, not just because it's World Series night, but might have subconsciously been influencing me, but I'm hoping to promote a little dialogue after these discussions. I know some of the collegians are going to meet over at the Ark afterwards to carry on this discussion, and I'm hoping that happens. So I'm setting a new deadline for myself of 9 o'clock throughout this particular series, and try to keep to that. I think that was all, except for one of the physicians came up to me tonight and said, I changed my office hours, this better be good. Well, I could take a few more minutes to prepare, I suppose. So, the problem now of our personal relationships, and one of the things I'm suggesting is that this is in part a sociological problem. There's ways in which the culture in which we live make it difficult to relate to other people. Sometimes we are overly concerned about image, for example. We live in an image-laden culture. Politicians have to have the right image to get elected. That becomes sort of a dominant concern. And when we're always concerned about our image or how we're coming across to people, how we are appearing, then we are in trouble very often. We can't end up dealing with what we really are, who we are, and how we're trying to enter into some sort of honest relationship. So part of the cultural problem is image. And just think how big that is. I mean, it almost counts for everything. Image takes over from substance so often. Buber says that about teachers. When you're more interested in the style than the content, then you're in big trouble as a teacher or as a therapist. When you begin to put too much emphasis on appearance and not what is the content, the substance of what's going on, then we have a problem. And then within our culture, a very civilized culture, as Buber likes to talk about it, there is a tendency to habitually pretend towards others, to feel something that we really don't. To say to people everything's fine when it isn't, to pretend we're in a good mood when we're not, to sort of fake it as we go along. Again, maybe for the sake of appearances, but very often for other kind, maybe more legitimate kind of reasons, because we don't want to offend people, we don't want to make them unhappy, we don't want to come across as being a downer for other people, and so on. Another kind of problem. Third sociological problem connected with this is that we may well act out of our role or position in society rather than in an authentic way. In other words, I'm the priest and therefore I'm supposed to act in a certain way. I mean, it doesn't matter really who I am, but I end up playing a role in a way. And then that gets reciprocated. That just sort of snowballs. And people expect me to act in a certain way because I'm a priest. That reinforces the idea that I should act that way. And before long, we've got a very unreal situation that makes personal relationships really impossible. And again, we can see the same thing in terms of student-teacher relationships, parent-offspring relationships, and so on. Certain playing out a role that makes it difficult. Fourth thing I think that intensifies the problem is that we live in this bureaucracy. We live in a world where people are slotted. I mean, you work at McDonald's and you got a job to do. I mean, can't deviate and have a little creativity in making hamburgers or something, I mean, you do it. You're programmed into all of this. And not just in that kind of job, but in many other functions in life. And when we are in slots like that, it becomes very difficult to relate in this more authentic way. On the other hand, I mean, to move to the psychological level, those are sort of sociological reasons why we have difficulty with personal relationships. I'm sure everyone here could think of a lot more. Those are some that come to mind. Then there are psychological reasons as well. One is that we simply don't feel confident. We don't feel good about ourselves, and because we don't, it is hard to reach out to another, to listen to another, to overcome defensive-ness, and so on. Then we might be simply echoing the crowd. I guess we could put it in terms of peer pressure, or in a more adult fashion, being overly concerned with what other people think, or taking on the values of the crowd, or of the group that we belong to, so that they're not appropriated, they're not our own, so that when we talk, we sound like we're into group speak. I must say that this comes to mind. I heard a marvelous homily today by Andrew Greeley. Monsignor Edward Herr died down in Lima, and his funeral was today. Great man, and Father Andy Greeley was there to give the homily. He's every place. Phil Donahue's show, he's every place. He's giving homilies at funerals, and it was marvelous. I couldn't help, in the middle of it, he was talking about pushy people like Peter, who stumbled and bumbled his way through life, like many of the more recent popes have done, I guess. Is that how he said it? Something like that. And I've forgotten my point. Why did I bring that up? Group speak. Yes. I had this idea. Thank you. This is a test in dialogue tonight. This is one of Buber's main ideas, dialogic teaching. Dialogic. When you lose your place, they'll help you. That's trust. What's needed. Group speak, I know what brought it to my mind is very often when I'm talking to bishops and they're normal, ordinary people and everything's fine, and then you bring up the question of something like women's ordination and you suddenly feel like you're talking to a computer or to a machine or to somebody who's just mouthing some sort of a party line. And that's very disconcerting in conversation, isn't it? You suddenly feel like something changed, like we were having a nice talk and now I'm talking to somebody else. So, what did I call that? Group speak? I don't know if that really fits or not, but it's something like that. We are mouthing something else that we've been told. It's like you ask a Catholic person, what do you believe? And they say, well, the church says. That's a good example of it. The church says. No, I didn't ask that, what the church says. I asked you, what do you believe about this? Then we might be able to have some honest conversation. But if you want to just tell me what the church says, we're probably not going to enter into any kind of genuine dialogue as Buber wants us to do. Another problem psychologically in all of this is that we don't know what we think and feel about things. We find ourselves sort of scattered in all of that, and therefore in conversation it becomes hard to say anything clear or definite that might elicit a response or further the dialogue as we're searching for some greater truth. And finally, I would say part of the problem is the counterpoint of that, and that is to be anomic, that is, to have no rootedness, to have no sense of belonging to a tradition or being part of something larger, that every time I come into a relationship it's like starting all over, starting from scratch, and therefore I don't bring any solid thinking and outlooks or wisdom with me as I come to the conversation. Well, that's one part of my way into the problem. I mean, it comes off just in simple ways, doesn't it? How do parents and offspring relate? How are people going to get along with roommates? How are we going to make marriages work in the contemporary world? How are physicians going to function in a more humane way? How are clergy going to be real servants of the people? How are lovers going to communicate at some real depth? It's constant. I mean, at work, how do bosses deal with people who work under them in the chain of command? It's all over the place. Personal relationships, how do we improve them? Part of what we are all about. Now, in order to gain some insight into this, as this whole premise of this series, we look at some great thinker in order to see what they have to say, and we try to enter into conversation with them. We want to have a dialogue with them. We want to bring our problems, our current concerns, to them in a way. And we meet them through their writing. We meet them through the books they've written, or the articles, or the lectures they've given, their legacy. And we try to interact with that, bring our questions, and hear what they have to say in the light of those questions. Or to reverse it, we try to retrieve from them insights, inspiration that will enable us to reflect more deeply, systematically, carefully, and fruitfully on our current experience. So that's what we want to do with our friend here, Martin Buber. So I asked you to read a little bit about him at the beginning there, just so I wouldn't have to go through all of that, just so you know who he is, when he was born, and things like that. And I want to concentrate very properly, I think, on some of his encounters in life. The story is clear in the notes there, born in Vienna and so on, lived a long life, died in 1965, mostly in Europe and so on, taught at different universities, was editor of different magazines and so on, wrote a lot of books. Most important is his classic work, I and Thou, as it is noted in the bibliography. That's what he is known for and what we'll have to try to probe tonight. If we're looking for commentary on Buber, then we have a 3-volume set. This is volume 3 here by Morris Friedman, who is a great scholar on Buber, and these are written in the 80s, and extensive work, and you find that in the bibliography here if you're interested in that. So what I want to do now is to look at some of his personal encounters in life, and to see what happened in those, and then to draw some sort of conclusions from those, to see what we might see and learn from those. Now I want to start by reversing this, and when Martin Buber was having was visiting the house, he was in the United States, and he was visiting Maurice Friedman's house, and Maurice's wife made a birthday cake for him and so on, and they had a fine party, and afterwards, Friedman's wife wrote about her reactions to Martin Buber. And I'm going to be reading a number of things tonight. I hope that isn't going to take away from anything, but it seems a way to get the flavor of impact in relationships. She wrote to a friend who lived here in Ohio, Martin Buber is greater than his books. Now that's a constant theme throughout anybody who interacted, who ever met him personally. He's greater than his books. And this, it seems to me, is a very telling statement in itself, because his books are very great, like I, Thou. Martin Buber is greater than his books because he lives what he has written. And the living embodiment of the Word is a more marvelous achievement than the writing down of the Word. Example, life, more important than what you say. I have seen him in many different situations, and always I have received the same impression of him. A real human being, interested in just this life we all live, and how to hallow just this very life. key theme in Buber. He's interested in this world, this life, hallowing each hour, each moment. I have never understood what it means to be a real human being, but Martin Buber has now shown me. He is, second, a religious man, not a spiritual man or a mystic. That's greatly debated whether Buber was a mystic or not. He always said he was not. There's a lot of indications that in certain ways he was. And Eugenia Friedman's wife goes on, the difference is very important. Finally, I would say about Martin Buber that he is a man to whom one could tell anything about one's life and feel positive that he would not be shocked and that he would not judge. Something about that. Remember what people used to say when they met Gandhi? They used to say, in Gandhi's presence, you could not lie. Could not speak falsehood in Gandhi's presence. And there's that same element in Buber. When people were around him, he elicited honest responses. Then she goes on. This will help us just get a little feeling. He's a short man, built stockily. He has a remarkably fine head, very imposing with his white beard that makes him look like a prophet. His brown eyes are the most outstanding physical feature he has. I shall never forget the look he gave me the first time I met him. Typical of great people very often. People would say the first time they met him, the look, the glance. Buber often talks about the glance and how important that is in human relationships. I would not call his eyes penetrating, but rather open. Sometimes when he looks at you, you feel that you are looking right into the man, and you feel a sudden great comforting warmth. He confirms the other person. Key idea in Buber, confirming the other. He smiles and laughs often. Often when he smiles, his face has a charming, disarmed look. I have seen him several times with a stern look that passed quickly, and he is always serious. This last doesn't bother me at all. In fact, it's a relief to me. I know that Martin Buber has suffered very much, but his suffering has knit him together into a whole human being. Often a suffering human being is like a sick or crippled human being, but not so with him. He turns to and responds to human encounter with his whole being in an absolute, consistent steadiness. I heard him say that the teacher's function is, quote, to give the student trust, just to be there for him like a mother is for the child. That is what Martin Buber does. He gives one trust. Well, now that's an example of a simple daily encounter. He goes to dinner, birthday party for Maurice's 30th birthday, and meets his wife, interacts with his wife, and this is the kind of impression that he leaves with her. She feels affirmed or confirmed. She feels a warmth come over her. She feels like she has really encountered a human being who cares about her. He gives one trust, the key to the human relationships. Well, now that's that would be an interesting idea, wouldn't it? When we say we'd like to improve our human relationships, it would be sort of interesting if sometimes we encountered people and afterwards they would say something like, I felt affirmed or confirmed in who I am. Or if they would say, I feel better about myself, or I trust a little bit more because of this encounter. So part of what Buber does, and this is a major element in understanding his thought, I think, is that a lot of his language and what he has to say to us is in terms of ideals, tremendously high ideals for personal relationships. That's mitigated, that's cut down in a way. That he understands limitation as well. I'm going to get to that. But for now, it's the ideal. So what we would like to pick up from this, I think, is the establishment of trust in relationships. Without that, we can't get any place. I often think in doing marriage counseling, when one partner's been unfaithful, and you say, can it ever come back? Can you ever get it back? Well, it seems like a long haul, and it takes time, and so on. But it's always that business of, can we establish the trust again? And over a period of time, yes, you talk honestly to me now, fine. And sometimes you see that slowly come back as sort of a softening and a letting go. The person is fearful to let go. Shall I let the other partner back in again? Shall I give him power over me again? I will a little bit more. The infidelity is never forgotten, in a sense, but it is overcome in the reestablishment of trust. Move in that direction. Buber was very big on possibility of what he called turning. Conversion is possible for him. You never want to write off a person or relationship. Always possible with God's grace. Turn it around and make it fruitful again. So, there we have my first sort of vignette about Buber and something that we might want to learn from all of that. Now, I want to take up another one here, happening in his life. When Buber was born in Vienna, grew up in his family, and when he was 3 years old, his mother disappeared. Of course, he had no idea where she went. I don't think anyone else knew either. As a matter of fact, she left and went to Russia and married somebody else, what she did. He didn't know that, of course. And he's 3 years old, and his mother's gone. So, what is he going to do about this? Well, he's going along, and he always thinks his mother's coming back. It's just a matter of time. Well, when he was 4 years old, he was up on a balcony or veranda someplace with a little girl who was a couple years older than he was. And he can't remember ever telling the little girl about anything about his mother or anything, but suddenly the little girl said to him, "No, your mother will never come back." Well, Friedman makes the point that, in a sense, is the decisive moment in Buber's life. It set up for him a whole sense of the insecurity of life. It brought out in what he called the notion of holy, H-O, not W-H, H-O, holy insecurity, which we want to talk a little bit about. But that changed everything for him, those early remembered experiences. Forever after, he was sort of searching for the feminine. Reminds me very much of another thinker we dealt with in this series. Thomas Merton, right. He lost his mother at a young age, and forever after was searching for the feminine, searching for the woman that would complete. It reminds me of someone else in this series, Bernard Lonergan, who said, if one has really enjoyed and been privileged to have the love of a mother throughout one's early years, that one will never feel lonely. Interesting. I don't know how far to take that, but in this series we've seen a number of people who have dealt with this particular problem at the young age of the problem with the mother. So forever after, Buber is somehow trying to deal with this lust. And it sets up for him this whole notion of this holy insecurity. So that what he felt was that life as a whole has an essential insecurity built into him. It's the same thing that other thinkers, like one of his mentors, Soren Kierkegaard, called anxiety or angst. That at the very center of things there's a feeling that something's wrong. Things aren't right. It's what we in our tradition know as original sin. That the human situation is flawed. That in the very center of our being it isn't right. We're not okay. And we know that. And we know that other people aren't okay. It's set up, again, to use one of his favorite images that dominates his thought throughout his life, it sets us on a narrow ridge. On either side there is an abyss. We walk, in other words, in risk. Put it another way, he says that every personal relationship is when you're treating the other person like a person, and it's good, and they're treating you that way, sooner or later, you or they will treat the other as an object. That becomes inevitable. In his language, every I-thou relationship, which represents the ideal, I-thou, kind of thing that Eugenia experienced in the relationship with him, that it will always devolves into an I-it relationship, where one of the other partners is going to treat the other as an object. We'll talk more about that. But that is what sets up the risk in relationships in Buber's mind. Because immediately, if you sort of allow the other in and reveal oneself, open oneself to the relationship, then the other person, if they decide to treat you like an object instead of a person, can hurt you so terribly. One then feels used. I think this came back. I haven't thought of this in a long time. I was sitting talking with one of my best friends, and we were having an interesting conversation, and he said something that I thought was really neat. And I took a piece of paper and I wrote it down. Well, he told me that really bugged him. It really upset him. He felt used somehow. I thought it'd be sort of flattering, that's a neat idea. Let's get that down, And he felt used. Interesting. How easily, in some way, relationships or small things can move it away from this I-thou to this I-it, or dealing with the other person as an object. Now, you catch the force of the problem. In other words, this human condition of ours is pretty messed up. Because we want to have relationships, and we want to be close, and we want to be intimate and share deeply, and yet that very openness creates the possibility of being hurt. We are dealing with insecurity necessarily. We are walking the narrow ridge. Now, what Buber says about this is interesting. He says that one of the great problems in relationships is that people are always walking around trying to avoid that. Try to figure out how not to get hurt, how to get over the insecurities, how to get more confident and have it all flowing properly. And he says much of our energy and time is spent doing that precise thing. So we want to control the relationship, or make sure we don't get hurt, make sure it's at some sort of high level, and that we're reaching these ideals. And Buber says that's exactly wrong. That isn't how we should function at all, because that's what produces anxiety. That produces anxiety. And so what does he think? And this is his interesting phrase. It's not just insecurity, but holy insecurity. In other words, he's giving it a positive valuation. He's seeing this insecurity that's as of the essence of life. You can't get over it anyway. You can't get around it. It's built into the human condition. Therefore, what you've got to do, as I've used this line before, as my Rolfer said to me, lean into it. As he's putting his elbow into my rib, lean into it. Lean into the pain. And it won't hurt so much. As soon as you resist my elbow like that, it's going to hurt you more. Lean into it. And that, I guess maybe has even become a jargon phrase. I don't know if it's from the Rolfers or not. But it represents a sort of graphic way of saying what Buber wants us to do. That is, learn to accept the insecurity. Learn to accept the risk factor in relationships. Learn that you got to walk the narrow ridge anyway. So why get so upset about it? Everyone else is walking on that narrow ridge also. Got to live with the insecurity. So it's a holy insecurity. That is, it's redeemable. It's transformable. It can work for us and not against us. Now, and that's, again, an interesting, I find Buber, to me, is very provocative. He comes at the question of personal relationships at a far deeper level than most of the pop psychology that we run into today. Or he's dealing with something that I think it's at the core of who we are and what goes wrong. He doesn't have techniques for winning friends and influencing people, if that was the phrase. No techniques for doing that. He wants us to adjust fundamental religious attitudes and outlooks. So, how often, does this happen in relationships where the real problem is a sense of insecurity, like, I got to watch these kids, they're going to get out of line. I can't give them too much freedom because they'll blow it. Therefore, I got to be on top of them every minute and tell them what to do and keep them in line. That's the teacher then who just has to make sure everything's programmed. We can't have too many questions or dissent in here. Got to keep it in line so we all have it. Reminds me, I used this line before when I was in a frenzy like that at the end of a class on Christology, and I was saying, God, I got to wrap this up. Get it straight. People are leaving this class, and one professor at Bowling Green looked at me and says, trust us, Father. We're adult people, you think, and so on. Trust us. And I think that, that speaks to that same point. How often in relationships people want to control the whole thing and manipulate so that hurt can't happen. Or the other thing that happens, I think, is that people keep up walls and don't ever let the other person in fully or enter into intimate relationship because then I can avoid the hurt. So you understand his practical advice for us is lean into the insecurity. Go walk on the narrow ridge. Join the human race. Go ahead and risk in that way. Sort of let that be. Let it happen. Trust us. Trust. See, that always gets back to every one of these vignettes that I'm dealing with here will always take us back to the religious question. You can ask yourself, well, why should I do that? I might fall off the narrow ridge and fall into the abyss, into the pit. And that's always back to the religious outlook. Buber was a believing Jew and had great faith in what the one he called the eternal thou, the great presence, one we call God. And it's only because of that great God being with us that we could trust the whole process. Okay, let me go on to another one here. Now, another encounter. And this one is strange, I suppose, but stay with it. This is when Buber is young. I don't know how old. Well, anyway. He had a horse. And he's talking about when he was with the horse. Thank you. Dialogic. Beautiful. He says, when I stroked the mighty mane, sometimes marvelously smooth comb, at other times just as astonishingly wild, and felt the life beneath my hand, it was as though the element of vitality itself bordered on my skin. Something that was not I, was certainly not akin to me, palpably the other, the horse, different from me, not just another, really the other with a capital O itself. And yet, it let me approach, the horse did, confided itself to me, placed itself elementally in the relation of thou and thou with me. The horse, even when I had not begun by pouring oats for him into the manger, very gently raised his massive head, ears flicking, then snorted quietly as a conspirator gives a signal meant to be recognizable only by his fellow conspirator. And I was approved. What's the play I'm flashing on? Equus, yeah. Equus. Kid puts the blinds of the horse. I was approved. Now, let me just complete this. On another occasion, he's with the horse. And he's petting the horse. And as he's doing so, it struck him what fun it was. and suddenly he became very conscious of his hand. The game went on as before, but it was no longer the same. The next day came into the horse again. This time he gives him a rich feed and strokes his mane, but the horse does not raise his head. Aware of how his relationship to the horse had changed, he now felt himself judged. He goes on to comment further on it about his lapse into monologue here. Now, a number of things that I want to draw from this. First of all, the suggestion is that if we are going to do well in our personal relationships, that we have to have a generally good relationship with our world, our environment, with the whole of being, which would include rocks and plants and animals, and for Buber, the world of spiritual life that we often call angels as well. In other words, put it this way. If a guy is at work and he's in nothing but I-it relationships, that is, all the people at work are nothing but objects to get the job done, cogs in a machine, works that way all day long, interacts with people like that, then comes home and expects to enter into warm, loving relationships, he might have trouble doing that. Buber has a sense that we have to act as total people. What he's after is for us to be integrated, to have a consistent approach to life. And part of the consistent approach would be that we would bring this sense of reverence about life to everything. So that Buber's often made fun of for saying that he can have any of us can have an I-thou relationship with a tree or a horse. And he definitely insisted on that all through his life. That you can reverence nature just as we reverence people. In fact, that's one of the best ways for beginning to reverence people. Because now we are treasuring the whole of God's creation. We are creating a reverential attitude within us, an attitude of respect for what is. A lot of religious experiences were under trees, weren't they? Throughout history. Interesting. Well, Buber has a sense of encountering the tree and as a whole thing, and feeling the bark and appreciating its total beauty and so on. Nice way to start. Wouldn't that be interesting that has to be a starting point, in a sense, for helping to improve our personal relationships. Now, a second thing I want to gain from that story has to do with touch. Buber, of course, touch is so important to intimacy, isn't it? I mean, we know that now in terms of healing. People who work in hospitals know, when you're going to talk to somebody, if you hold their hand or touch them. Very often when people are very tuned in, that seems to be very powerful. I remember talking with a woman pastoral minister one time, and she had functioned as the pastor. She'd done marvelous things, held the community together, and I sort of in a bizarre, strange gesture, I said something about, I put my hands on her head and I said, you really ought to be ordained, with the gesture of laying on of hands. And she later told me that was an extremely significant event for her. The sort of touch. It'd be interesting to see how many people understand that story. I think it's revealing, whether one understands what that story might mean or be about. Anyway, Buber says that in touching, that the mistake is to concentrate on oneself. You notice what he did? He started thinking, this is fun for me. And then he was conscious of his hand. And that's when, as he says, the monologue started. Now that suggests that the touching can have a very different character. He says that if you want to try to get over that problem in a way, that what you should try to do is to feel what the other person is feeling when you touch them. I have a feeling that this says something about masochism and how to deal with that. You know, I think there is so often in sexuality there is that sort of masochistic tendency. Maybe slight, sometimes more, but there. And the question is, what do how does one handle that? And I think what the suggestion of Buber, although he doesn't play this out explicitly, says somehow it's got to do with trying to feel what the other person is feeling while you are touching them instead of what you're feeling. Feel behind their skin. You'd be inside of them. The problem, as you can see, is that it becomes turned back on oneself. It becomes an egocentric interaction, and that seems to be what sets up the monologue, and then the other person feels treated like the object. I'm going to pause for questions. My general thought was I was going to just plow through and then stop and have questions. Sort of doing it differently than I have before. Let me try another one here. This is really vital to understanding Buber. I debated a lot whether I would take this one up first, but I think our background is going to help us a little here. There's a story he tells. He calls it a conversion. And this is now quote, "What happened was no more that one forenoon, after a morning of religious enthusiasm," he's into his prayer and so on, "I had a visit from an unknown young man, without being there in spirit." Key phrase, remember that one. "I certainly did not fail to let the meeting be friendly. I did not treat him any more remissly than all his contemporaries who were in the habit of seeking me out about this time of day as an oracle that is ready to listen to reason. I conversed openly and attentively with him, only I omitted to guess the questions which he did not put. Later, not long after, I learned from one of his friends, he himself was no longer alive, the essential content of these questions. I learned that he had come not casually, but born by destiny, not for a chat, but for a decision. He had come to me. He had come in this hour. What do we expect when we are in despair and yet go to a man? Surely a presence by means of which we are told that nevertheless there is meaning. Since then, I have given up the religious, which is nothing but the exception, extraction, exaltation, ecstasy. Remember, he was praying before the young man showed up. I've given that up. Or it has given me up. I possess nothing but the everyday, out of which I am never taken. The mystery is no longer disclosed. It has escaped, or it has made its dwelling here, where everything happens as it happens. I know no fullness, but each mortal hour's fullness of claim and responsibility." That's what happened. I guess the lad went and committed suicide. You notice, it's interesting. He was attentive, he said. He was engaged, civil, conversing. But somehow he had failed to perceive the real meaning of what was going on in that encounter. He had missed the sort of ultimate significance. You notice the line is, he had not come for a chat, he'd come for a decision. He'd come wrestling with his life. And that very much is what put Buber on to this whole I-thou business, and the contrast with I-it. It showed him the seriousness of this whole business of how we relate. And it suggested to him that what is really called for in any situation is that we meet the other person as they really are, and not as we might think they are or wish they were. It means that we try to engage ourselves in each moment fully present, alive to what's happening, alert to what the other person is trying to tell us. It means that we try to recognize the struggles that the other person may well be involved in. We try to adopt, in Buber's terms, an I-thou relationship, where the other person is treasured, where the really vital thing that's happening is the interchange. Now this takes us to the heart of what Buber is all about. He has a line that goes like this: in the beginning there was relation, or in the beginning there is relation. He thinks that we only come to be a person through interaction with others. That what really counts in life is that we are partners with the other. That's what constitutes human existence. It's the opposite. In modern times, ever since Descartes, who died in 1650, there's been in our modern Western mind an individualistic outlook on life that sort of says, here I am, now I'm going to look out on that world. Maybe sometimes I begin to wonder if it's real or not. Oh, I see it as a lot of objects out there I can control and move around and change, or maybe I'll start to interact with in some ways. But I start out from that premise. And that's the sort of subjective premise that almost all modern thought has taken and is in the general air. I mean, you don't have to be a philosopher to know that we're into a situation where many people think of life that way. They don't think relationship first, they think individuality first. I am an individual. Now we'll see if we can get along or not. And what Buber says is that's wrong at this very beginning. If you start there, you'll always be wrong. You'll never get your life straight from then on. You'll always be in danger of treating the other as object, of having only I-it relationships, and that's all it'll ever be. You have to start someplace else, and the starting point is I-thou, which is a phrase. It's not like I'm here and you're there, and that's, you're the thou, I'm I, and okay, let's start to talk. I-thou is a word that describes the context, the whole thing here. As Buber likes to say about religious experience, it's interesting that we often think, well, I have a religious experience. I met God on the golf course or something. And Buber says, we don't have religious experiences like that, because the Spirit doesn't exist just in me or in you, but the Spirit exists in the between, in the relationship. I suppose this gets a little sticky or hard to understand, but put negatively, I think we can maybe understand what he's trying to tell us. He's worried about a mere subjectivism. He's worried about individualism, as we know it in our culture. I'm going to get ahead, I'm going to do my own thing, and if I have time to relate to you, we'll talk about it. And Buber says, wrong. We don't exist without relationship. We aren't an I without the thou. Only the thou can make me into an I. I need you. We need each other to become not an individual, but a person. To become, to develop our talents and gifts. So immediately, life is relational. Well, that's what he thinks they have to see. He says, now, there's two ways to get messed up on that. One is to be so concentrated on feelings. You know, he thinks we're overboard on that. And, you know, in our culture, we're big on that. I can check out my feelings. I can know when I'm angry, or know when I'm jealous, or know when I'm happy, and straighten all that out. You know, and I know oftentimes I'm talking about affective conversion and the importance of that. Buber thinks that, you know, maybe okay, you can do a little of that if you got the premise right. If you remember that we're not a bundle of feelings. That's not what we are in his anthropology, his understanding of human existence. We are relational. And once we got that straight and we're dealing with relation, and we know that how essential that is and that we need each other, then maybe I could go back and talk about feelings or investigate your feelings in this relationship. In other words, he thinks we get hung up on that. I always think of young people trying to get it together, and we give a lot of advice to say, you know, talk about your feelings to one another. I think there's something good about that, but I can see where it also has a danger. He thinks that it just ends up making us more egocentric. I'm happy while you're listening to me tell you about how bad I feel. You know, then everything's great. You know, then we'll trade places for a while. And Buber says that's not where relationships are about. Relationships have to do with whole person being partner for one another. First, we have to have that straight. That's one problem area. That is that the feelings get overblown and made too much of. The other is, on the other side of this thing, is that we live in an institutional world. That the it becomes everything, that dominates everything that goes on. When we don't have I, thou right, then we're a member of an organization. And we define ourselves that way. We define ourselves by our roles. That's what he would say is wrong. You know, I'm a priest, so relate to me as a priest instead of as a person. Buber says that's what messes us up then. That's can't allow for real dialogue. That's the world of I, it. Who are you? Well, I'm a businessman, or I'm a mother, or I'm all of these other functional roles. Define ourselves according to our slot or place in the world. And when we do that, again, he thinks we're messed up. Another way the I, it takes over is that science becomes the only way of understanding who we are. In other words, if we're going to try to do psychology, then we're going to study animals, figure out responses that animals make and so on to various stimuli, and then try to apply that to humans. Well, Buber says, okay, you know, you might learn something that way from the behaviorists, from B.F. Skinner, so you might learn something, but only if you've got it in the larger framework of I, thou, of relationship that comes first. We are persons to one another. So the second thing that goes wrong here is that we end up making the it world overwhelm the other world. Important point about all of this. His book, remember, is titled I, Thou. It's his classic work. It's a very poetic work. It is, I suppose, difficult to understand in many ways. On the other hand, if we read it as poetry and just allow it to do something to us, I think it is very valuable. But one of the points he makes in here is that we can't try to live I-thou relationships all the time. It's impossible. The thou will become an it, but that in a sense is okay. Don't get bent out of shape over that. Don't get bent out of shape that we live in an institutional world, or that we got empirical science. That's good. In other words, Buber says there's got to be a proper alternation between I-thou living and I-it. So, I mean, if you got a job to chop a tree down, you don't try to go at it like in an I-thou relationship. You know, you got to chop it down, get the job done, and that's necessary. But if one is chopping trees down like that all the time and working in a factory or dealing with every person as I, it, then thou gets submerged, and we become less than human. You cannot do without I, it, he says, but when I, it takes over, then we're in trouble. And that's what he sees as what's happened in the modern world. We've lost organic relationships, lost the sense of closeness, of true intimacy. A lot of talk about it, but very rarely does he think it happens. I, it takes over, and you don't get the proper balance or alternation between those two worlds. So, what we were taking, that whole experience there, yeah, so the I, thou. I think on our notes here, we try to look at some things that would flow from that. In and I, and this is C on the back part of the note. These would be some things that would flow from an understanding of the I-thou relationship. Let the other person surprise us. Don't say we can read them like a book. Allow them to be mysterious, to be converted, to turn around, to become a better person, to do something different. Don't pin people oftentimes to their mistakes. Practical advice now. Don't let familiar responses cloud their uniqueness. In other words, well, almost always in the past when I said this, she got mad. So, she'll probably get mad again. Well, Buber is more inclined to say, let's give people a chance. Let's allow this to happen. I was talking to a very fine psychotherapist in town here about this who sort of had some objections to a lecture I gave in talking about charity being a higher virtue than frankness or candidness, a principle which I still insist on. But this therapist was telling me that I was selling people short. In other words, I was saying that sometimes I'm not going to say candidly, frankly, what I feel or think in this situation because I feel that it will hurt somebody else or destroy them, or not, maybe destroy is too big a word, but will not work for the good. It'll hurt too much. And he was saying to me, well, that's selling the other person short. It's falling into this error here that don't let familiar responses cloud the other person's uniqueness or possibilities. I still want to argue that point, but it seems to me that Buber is sort of speaking to it here. Give other people a chance. Use words to really communicate. He thinks that a big part of our problem is that we use words to cloud the issue, to divert attention, to confuse, to dissemble. Too much language like it. Not outright lying, but oblique statements that don't allow the truth really to be grasped on both sides. In touching others, try to feel what they are feeling from the inside. I already talked about that. Don't see others through preformed categories. Now, an obvious thing, don't try to experience them or use them. To experience another person in Buber's categories is a bad phrase. And there's a way in which I can pick up on that. I mean, to go out looking for personal experiences, in his mind, would be a big mistake. That isn't what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be allowing things to happen, and we're supposed to be meeting or encountering people and allowing them to be who they are. But when you start talking about looking for experiences, then we're almost always going to be involved in using and controlling situations, and he doesn't want that to happen. Approach others with an open spirit. And that's a lot of what this attitude he wants us to command. Carl Rogers, who was very influenced by Buber and quoted him and so on, said that that was one of the most important things about dealing with reality, is to drink it in. Drink in the person rather than having our grids all in place by which we categorize them and force them to respond perhaps as we have expected. He wants us to drop the grids. Does that make sense to anybody? And drink in the other person. Listen to what they're really saying. That would be great advice for parents dealing with collegians as collegians become adults, or as collegians began to relate to their parents in a new way, to allow their parents to be, to listen with new ears and not the way one heard those same phrases at the age of 15. That would be bad. You keep always hearing the same words in the same way and never giving the other a chance, the parental generation, in a sense, to develop or to grow or to do something in a new way. Then what he wants us to do here is not to see misogyny, but to see their center and their wholeness. I was talking to a young woman who just quit a very high-paying job. And one of the reasons she quit it is she was a managerial position and she was always had to analyze everything. And she said she found herself analyzing people that way. And she became very analytical in everything and even in her marital relationship. And she said she didn't like that in herself. And she ended up quitting that job, taking about half the pay, I guess, to do other kind of work, because she sensed that she was losing her personal touch or her ability to enter into partnership, to synthesize, to see whole. Notice that's one of the things he keeps saying. Don't think of the tree just as branches and leaves, but the tree as a whole. Think of the other person not just as a bundle of responses or feelings or a great intellect or something like that, but to allow the person in its totality, their totality, to come to us. Find God in the enjoyment of one another. Buber is very big on it. You don't find God by retreating from the world. He says that in every authentic encounter with a thou, the eternal thou is present. The real center point of all of it is the one who is both wholly other, WH, and wholly the same, and wholly present. Begins to get at his picture of God. So God, for Buber, we only know God in terms of relationship. He's the related one. You can't explain God. You can't summon God. You can only address God in worship, in prayer. It's one of his key phrases. You can only address God. Speak words of praise and thanksgiving, gratitude, glory to God. Find God in the enjoyment of one another. There's that thing in many times in Christian circles, we have lost sight of that. Our Jewish friends are often helpful in this. That is, to find God in the pleasurable things of life, the bodiliness of life, in historical events, real life, family life, marital love. Find God there as the eternal thou. Get beyond appearances and conveying a good image. I already talked about that. Use one's evil impulses in a positive way to transform them. Now, this really gets a bit tricky. I don't know how much really to go into this. Buber is not one who would say that human nature is just all positive and plus and neat. He understood the kind of thing that Carl Jung understood as well, and many others, that there's a dark side to us. There's an unruly side to us. And if you can stomach the word, there's a demonic. In other words, a person like Buber flies in the face of the sort of naive optimists of life, who think everything's just going to get better and better and neater and neater, and if we're all nice people and we'll all get along. He doesn't think that. He thinks, and he borrows from the Talmud in this, there is evil impulse. There is sort of a surplus of negative energy that's around as well. I suppose we know it in jealousy or anger that doesn't seem appropriate, or feeling crummy about oneself when one is really a fine person. That sort of negative energy that's flowing. And Buber says, you notice here, the usual thing that he thinks is we would repress that and pretend like we don't feel it. And again, his idea is, no, let's transform it. Let's see that as part of life. Well, here's how it comes to me. I'll talk to two people. Each one will have weird fantasies. Let's say weird sexual fantasies. One person will end up thinking they're weird. Another person will say, that was strange, and forget it. I have a sense that almost all human experience and imaginative life and thinking and impulses are pretty common. If we all knew everything that all the rest of us felt or went through or experienced, I'll bet we'd find out an awful lot of commonness. But what seems to be different is what attitude we take towards that. And some people, when they encounter that negative side, just then say, that's weird. I must be a bad person. I must be different from everybody else. And other people laugh it off or think, join the human race, or I'm human, or that's part of life. And that's what Buber, I think, is getting at. Or that's my way of saying what I think is contained in his point here. Let's transform them, don't repress them. Let's make those negative energy flows work for us in a way. Maybe Jesus did that in the cleansing of the temple, when he let his anger work for him to make a symbolic gesture, instead of sitting around saying and feeling guilty because he was mad. Where are we? You treat others as a thou, even if they treat us as an it or object. And the last 2 points go together. Buber thinks that's our responsibility. Even if people don't react well to us or push us around, use us, don't listen to us, ignore us, and so on, we shouldn't do that in return. We should treat others as thous, because that's what they are. They are worthy of respect. But when you do that, recognize the limitations. Don't walk around then feeling upset because they don't reciprocate. Don't feel sorry for yourself because, geez, I'm so generous and they don't do back to me. Start out with a sense of limitation. I think that works in any kind of relationship. Two people are close. There's one day when the other person's out of sorts, they're in a bad mood, they're tired, they can't respond effectively. So one continues to try to be kind or treat them as a subject, as a thou, but without expecting at that point any clear mutuality or any reciprocation. Isn't there a subtle temptation in all that then but to get mad? Where were you when I needed you? How could you treat me like that? Instead of allowing the other person their time with I-it. That gets back to, a lot of people misunderstand Buber. They think that it's always supposed to be I-thou. And he understands it can't be that way, so let's accept it to begin with. I got to save time for questions. Take up one more kind of encounter here. No, we can't. I'm going to end. We'll take it after this. We can do it now, and I won't do this part. No, I'm ending at 9, and it's 15 more minutes. There's no sense in taking a break. Carl Rogers said, if you're an authoritarian, then don't pretend not to be. However, one could adjust, and what I'm going to do is turn to the questions. Not a stand-up break, but I'm going to entertain questions at this point, so I make sure that happens. we are leaving at least by now.
Lonergan, in fact, in your lecture, you said that Lonergan talked about this need to be honest. He said there's a greater value there. If you know that being honest to somebody you're going to devastate them, then honesty is not the way to go at that point.
Yes. I believe that we are off base in the culture as a whole. The point was that Lonergan said, among others, I don't really recall it precisely from him, but among others, that honesty can't be the final value in human relationships. That if it's going to be destructive, that one ought not be honest. I would say in a Christian viewpoint, Judeo-Christian viewpoint, that charity has to be the highest virtue. And charity looks for the good of the other. Love, as Buber talks about it, is really an effort to be there for the other. And in so doing, then that's when one's own self emerges. And I think that I'd say that's the highest virtue. But I mean, I'm giving play to this that maybe we sell people short. I think we have to ask that. Maybe we aren't frank enough. Maybe we don't give them a chance to bounce back, or maybe they're more resilient than we think.
I think it's giving them a little more about the I, thou, I, this dichotomy. If it's either or is it both and? How do you find this balance? Is it a balance, or is it some other?
Okay, the question is to say a little bit more about the I, thou, and the I, it, which is obviously crucial to the whole of what Buber has to say. He actually picked that phrase up from Feuerbach in the beginning of the 19th century, who used that I, thou phrase. So he really didn't originate it, but he put it in a different context. And he grew to that as he developed in his life. And it came in sort of a moment of revelation when he studied the Hasidic tradition. The Hasidim were a group of Jews that started in mid-18th century Poland, where people, the Hasidim, began to rediscover their roots, their Jewish heritage, and they formed themselves into communities, and they had the Tzaddikim, the leaders of those communities, and they told all these neat stories. And then it spread from Poland to the rest of Eastern Europe, to where before long about half of European Jewry was into Hasidism. And it was sort of a mystical type thing, a purity of the scriptures, a rebirth of Judaism, and so on. When Buber took 5 years out in his life, that's what he did. He went and studied those, read about that. And that began to give him, and then encountering that, the great leader of the Hasidic movement gave him a sense of fervor about life and having a direction in life. So he began to see this religious dimension of life. He began to see that you had to be rooted if you were going to relate. You had to be part of a tradition if you were going to act with confidence in dealing with other people. Goes back to the original points I was making. Why we often don't relate well is because of lack of rootedness. And so he saw that. Now, out of all of that, he began to develop this religious insight that there was a better way of living, that there was a way of overcoming this insecurity that plagued us. And that was by entering into honest relationships. So, but he saw those relationships had to be with nature, with persons, with the world of spirits, we would call angels, I guess, and with God. So that I, thou became a way of speaking about these relationships at their best. We could have an I, thou relationship with any of those four categories when we would treat them with reverence, when we would come at it wholeheartedly, where we'd be involved in the moment, when one would be meditating on the leaf like the Buddhists do, or when one would be immersed in prayer with God, or when one would be in honest conversation with an intimate partner, close, listening. They said Buber was a marvelous listener. Interacting, allowing the other to be. That's I-thou. So I-thou becomes a way of expressing how we would like the privileged moments of life to be. In any area. At any particular moment. But Buber recognized you can't live at that intensity all the time. I mean, people drive you nuts who want to be that intense all the time. Let's have another I-thou. 5 hours of I-thou. I remember being in some of those sensitivity training sessions in the 60s. Those were great. Sit there for a half hour and stare into each other's eyes. Remember those? Don't move, just stare at each other's eyes. Anyway. I don't think Buber would like sensitivity training sessions particularly. But what he thought the key wasn't a technique, the key is attitudinal. That's what I-thou's about. It's attitudinal. It's how we approach life, how we treasure the moment, how we live in the present. That's one of his big categories is time. I mean, there's so much I think, but at the age of 14, he almost committed suicide. And the reason he almost committed suicide was he had this overwhelming sense of infinity of time. Pascal was taken by the stars and the infinity of space and felt overwhelmed. But Buber was overwhelmed by the infinity of time. When does it all end? When did it start? He felt like committing suicide. It was such an overwhelming problem to him. So he began to sense the difficulties of life and needing a way to overcome it. I-thou was his way of dealing with this. On the other hand, he understood that I-it was a necessary part of life, and a good part. I-it could cut two ways. It could become manipulative or controlling, or it could send you back to a search for something deeper. It could be almost sacrament, and he uses that word, interestingly enough. The world is a sacrament. Time. Live in the present moment. Now is all we have. The past, the manipulative person, the self-willed person, is always dealing with forming things, the past. In other words, instead of enjoying what's ever going on, they're always waiting for it to end. I've said this so often, every time I think back to a pastor I lived with, his whole life that way. It was always, well, confessions are over. Well, Easter's over. Well, this is over. I mean, everything. It's over. I mean, it was never like, well, let's do this. Or let's have fun doing this, or let's enjoy doing this. It just strikes me. I mean, some people play golf that way till it's over. I mean, get to the 19th hole, it's over. That's what he called about living with I-it in the past, out of sync with the present. So I-it has its place. Can't be intense at every moment. We got to have science. We got to have factories. We got to get things done. We got to have political processes. We got to have our moments of watching soap operas or whatever else. Got to have the escape times. That's fine. You've got nothing against it. But when that predominates and destroys I-thou, and makes them impossible, that's when we're in trouble. You see, that I-it then takes over, becomes our habitual way of dealing with people. I don't have time to talk with you, Sidney. I'm sorry. Because I don't ever have time for anything. It becomes habitual then. So you treat your wife like you treat machines at work. And then that's when the culture's screwed up. And that's what he thinks is the major problem. Bill?
I guess, when you talked about when you talked with that gentleman who's probably working with you there, I have some trouble understanding why he was so moved by that. Because he said that in the beginning, he really think of individuals, people as individuals first, and noticed that was wrong. And that starts an I-it relationship. But for some reason, you'll know it just where it clicks. You know, like you just talk about something. The more you find out about it, like just going so great, like second conversation, you really, when you live here, you realize you're really lucky to have met this person. But that thing just came, like he didn't come to a situation like that. He came to talk to that guy, and Buber realized that the person wasn't there in spirit, really. But how could he?
No, it was himself who wasn't there in spirit, though.
Oh, he says. Oh,
No.
he wasn't.
He was not there in spirit.
Oh, I thought
He
you realized.
himself. In other words, he felt terrible because the lad had come to talk about, my reading of it, whether he's going to commit suicide or not. And he chatted with him in a casual way. He didn't recognize what was really going on. And he was the sort of guru person. He was the one who ought to have been aware. And his sense was that if he had been totally immersed in the present, treated this person with utmost respect and reverence, he would have picked it up and thus been able to deal with it. Was he not present in spirit? And he's saying that taught him about life. He didn't want that to happen again. And it's sort of, that's what people say about him. All the encounters with him were intense. And in other words, he was with them. Although he laughed and had a good time and so on, but he was present, and that's what they felt. And that's all the difference. Okay? The story makes sense now? Who hasn't had a chance? You got 2 minutes here. Jeannie?
Historical time, or Buber see this in an evolutionary time in terms of, or at an earlier time, mankind was more into mind domination. And as a critique of modern society, you feel that it's more effective before.
Yes, he did feel that more primitive people had sort of natural I-thou relationships, and that the it world accumulates. The it world accumulates with the advance of science, with the Industrial Revolution, with all of our ways of quantifying things, the rise of the physical sciences and them becoming normative for the human sciences, and all down the line. So that we, in a sense, are more prey to the I-it than previous ages have been. Yeah, it was, we were in trouble that way. It was sort of progressive. And thus we are in a cultural crisis in his mind. And thus needing radical solutions. And most of the Band-Aid solutions in his mind simply won't work. You've got to go back to the most fundamental question. One of the titles of his essay, What is Man? Or as we would say today, who are we human beings? Who are we has to be answered first. And if you answer it by the first phrase, I am, then you're going to be messed up. And you'll never overcome the bureaucracy, the mechanistic notions of the modern age. You'll only overcome it in his mind if your first statement is we. We are. He was so big on community. One of the great triumph, of course, with him was the establishment of the kibbutzim in Israel. He undertook an adult education program in Israel. It was one of his great things to help people understand this and to live this more communal life. He saw the establishment of the kibbutzim, the communal life in Israel, as being the great culmination of his life. That's how he thought we were going to improve the world, was by small groups. He had the idea of religious socialism, politically, but he thought we would do it by getting the small groups together, but the groups would not come together around saying, let's build community, let's all get together and like one another and hold hands or something. But he said the way we'll do that is by having a common purpose, like revitalizing the country or something, and by recognizing that at the center of this community exists the eternal Tao. That the real lines of connectedness, the reason we're connected is because all of us are connected in with the eternal Tao. It's back to a religious solution. So his solution to modern life is community, communion, where everybody is respected and has their part to play, and where dialogue reigns, where we talk to one another, where we converse with as partners. Those are the tools for making the world better. Dialogue, interpersonal relationships, community life, which will then expand into social life as a whole, into political life. And that's the only way we can deal with the impersonalization of the world. And that's the only way we'll get wholeness. To go back to the sociological and psychological analysis I offered at the beginning. Thank you for the question, Jeannie, which allows me to tie it up. We'll talk again, for those who want to return, about Alfred North Whitehead and thinking of our religion, our Christianity, in more contemporary terms. How can we understand it in a modern framework, a modern evolutionary framework? Thank you.